Thank you so much, Mike, and to all members of the panel. So this brings us to the last segment of the conference. Somebody in the form of Serge Dupont has been listening and taking notes and concentrating all day on our collective behalf to share with us some of his insights and perspectives on the issues that we've heard about today. For many in this room, Serge needs no introduction, now a senior advisor at Bennett Jones, but prior to that, multiple distinguished appointments, both domestically and internationally in the energy and broader economic space. So Serge, I give you the floor. We're looking forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Merci Monica, c'est la fin d'une longue journée, beaucoup de conversations, alors j'essaierai de garder ça à quelques minutes seulement. Mike, you mentioned you had the pleasure of working with Anne McClellan as Minister of Natural Resources. I had the pleasure as Deputy of serving Lisa Raitt. No, she's still on the line. And then I actually had the pleasure of working with Anne at Bennett Jones. So I get the twofer, but it's the first time I'm going to get the last word.
That's right, Sarah.
So you are there.
Yes, we're here.
We're marking you.
So first, I want to congratulate Monica and the Positive Energy team, and not just for today, but actually for their ongoing work, which I consider as true public service. It's the pursuit of the public interest through rigorous intellectual contributions, through social, political sensitivity, and to getting these smart conversations, smart discussions, I think, as Nick called them earlier, going. And again, I think it's certainly as an alumni of University of Ottawa, I'm very proud to see this kind of work done here. So congratulations again, Monica and Mike and your teams. I cannot start to give justice to all the comments that were made today, the thoughts that were shared. And all of us will be reflecting on how the discussion today helps take this issue to the next steps for us in Canada, and certainly for Positive Energy for your next 5 years after the first very successful 3. I'll just offer a few quick thoughts that, obviously, and after the uplifting note, I would say, of the last panel, I don't want to be a downer, so I will come back, but I will certainly also, there were things today that were, forcing us to think hard about how we're going to do this. I come out of this thinking, okay, this is going to be hard, like really hard. It's going to take a lot of collaborative engagement. It will take a lot of very strong leadership. And it will also involve something we actually don't mention enough, that was mentioned by Catherine Porter today from the UK, a lot of solid expertise in energy systems. Like, we're not mucking around with details here. This is a core to the economy and indeed to our way of living. And that means very solid execution, which is perhaps where we tend to be a bit weak in particular, is, after the plan, the actual execution. So I'll talk very briefly about trust, credibility, and action, and perhaps a parallel to JP's frame of caring, believing, and doing. There are many tensions, obviously, for Canada in developing energy and climate policy and a path to net zero. The tensions are healthy. What we have to ensure, and I think that's where Positive Energy finds its mission, is trying to lessen some of this tension, ensure it's not exacerbated, work consistently to build the trust so that we can actually make progress. And what I think we actually really need to do is to find our stride here, and very soon. At least 2 types of tension I think I'd like to mention, and they're kind of obvious, but it's also always worth getting grounded into the reality we face. It's between, first, the tension among the interests and the perspectives that in some discussions appear irreconcilable, and where you actually see sometimes deficits of trust. And, I work and have lived in Ottawa pretty well all of my life, but I travel to Calgary a fair bit. And I see that, certainly for some proponents of the fossil fuels industry, that find that climate advocates have no genuine concern for the industry, they see an explicit hidden agenda of phasing out the industry. Some climate advocates find that industry fundamentally does not really care about emissions, that its actions are the bare minimum, and that its words sometimes amount to greenwashing. And so that trust deficit is there. It's kind of inherent, even though many leaders and a large portion of the general public, as was shown by Nick, hold much more balanced and certainly less polarized views. The compromise is still difficult. And this is something that I think Anne and Lisa would understand well from, not now, but from their former partisan days, which is that it's hard to build the compromise in the political narratives. Often it's just at the level of narrative that thing breaks down because it doesn't quite fit. And I've seen this working with both sides of the political spectrum here, both liberals and conservative governments. There's a reluctance to just go and add a qualifier to what is otherwise a really neat narrative. So that makes it difficult. There's also obviously the distrust that there continues to be in terms of the relationship between industry and the development proponents and First Nations. Although we've heard many times today that the First Nations are not opposed to development, they're opposed to a certain kind of development that excludes the First Nations, but that still needs a lot of work. Now, this deficit of trust can be overcome, and we've heard many times today that it can be done. Ed Whittingham talked about how it was done in Alberta at a point in time when people came together. Lisa and Anne are an example of trying to bring perspectives together in their coalition. They also talked about this neat example of a deliberative democracy as kind of an experiment. So it can happen, bringing people together and building that trust, but it's also easy in today's, kind of polarized politics to lose ground when you're gaining some. So that's an ongoing issue that has to be worked on, is just building out trust. The second piece is the tension that there is between what can be charted as paths on a chart or on a on a plan, basically, and what actually gets done. I heard a good one recently. Plans kind of are built in PowerPoints, but they die on Excel spreadsheets, and that's the difference there between the vision and the reality. Modeling for net zero often requires basically working back from a desired kind of end state and then trying to see what it implies. And there's, as I think was mentioned this morning by Robert, there's confirmation bias quite often in the models. I mean, the folks who build the models kind of know where they want to take the conversation sometimes, and so there's a bit of some bias there. And there's some assumptions made about closing technology and economic gaps that continue to be there when you're looking to get to net zero. Monica mentioned, for example, that there's some, some folks actually say, well, we shouldn't really worry about costs. It's the end game that worries. Well, no, actually costs do matter. So there's all this issue about what you actually bring into a model, into a discussion. There's obviously what we talked about as well, the assumptions that are built or that are not built in some of these models around energy security or energy affordability, the other two pieces of the trilemma that were mentioned, and how we kind of build that in. Next, polls seem to suggest that Canadians may be willing to pay a bit more for energy if certain things happen. That may sound true, but politicians will notice pretty quickly that if electricity prices go up, they know they're going to get a beating somehow at the polls, and they will be kind of thinking about that. Minister Nally mentioned some of that in terms of affordability in his remarks. We sit with President Biden in the United States. Quite remarkable how during the campaign it's all about climate change, and it's now all about getting more oil out of the industry because he needs to get the price of gasoline down. So this issue about affordability still needs to be dealt with. Sometimes folks forget about the fact that for the industry to make the investment, they actually need a positive return at the end of the day, a very basic fact of economics. It's not just about beating industry into regulation compliance. They actually, if they're going to invest to reduce the emissions, there actually has to be a positive return in some fashion, including with a carbon price, by the way, that can help. And what is really difficult as well is having all of the decision timelines for governments, regulators, private sector partners to come together, and the decision making and the actual investments that can be made in a sequence kind of way, such that this all comes together. Exceptionally difficult to do. It's difficult to do when, for example, one mine with one indigenous group in one location. Even more difficult to do when you're talking about linear projects or projects involving more than one government, more than one First Nation, and so forth. So this is why the models that you kind of have, or the projections of how we get to net zero, sometimes get invalidated by the reality. It's why the targets tend to be missed. It's why then you have a loss of credibility. And what you see from Nick, basically the dismal report card that governments get, and probably industry gets and others get, and then the global reputation that takes a hit as well. So these are all things where we actually need to be able to do better. So finding solutions and relieving some of the tension means really genuine dialogue, effective processes. We've heard about that work that Mike has done, effective institutions, solid public and private sector leadership, grounded in reality, ambitious, realistic goals, looking at concrete projects, how you actually get them done, realistic timelines, figuring out the path to decision-making, the execution. It cannot be just the high-level visions or the strategies. You actually have to roll up your sleeve, get down to the brass tacks of how you're going to do it. This morning, it was amazing in the presentation from Robert, the kind of scale and the number of projects that we will have to be able to. I'm working on one right now, one transmission project in Atlantic Canada, and it's hard. It's really hard with all the goodwill of all the participants. But look at the numbers that Robert was talking about today in terms of generation capacity, transmission capacity, CCUS, hydrogen. Getting all of that done right is going to be an enormous challenge. So we need to find a way to execute. There has to be a reasonable sharing of benefits and risks, including with Indigenous peoples as partners and possibly as equity partners in some cases. To my mind, I don't think it has to be equity all the time, but there has to be partners. There have to be some benefits. And there has to be, therefore, for the oil and gas as well, industry, which is so important to this country, a future that comes through what will be the energy and climate future for Canada. And if we actually manage to do that, and it's much, much, much easier said than done, then maybe you can reconcile. You can achieve reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, yes, but also reconcile climate and energy policy, reconcile the consumer and the industry, reconcile East and West Canada, reconcile urban and rural Canada, and reconcile perhaps also among generations, including for me at home with my kids, would be very helpful. Thank you. So, and then, but if you actually do build a narrative that actually is going to do that, we just need to find the narrative would be really helpful, in fact, in guiding behavior and getting the kind of human and institutional change that we need. This is daunting. It is really, really hard. Two things that I think to end on a better note, I would draw from both Anne and Lisa. Anne said we cannot afford to fail. That's always kind of a good reminder. And the second, I think Lisa was saying that, net zero, it's not just a matter of us wanting to do it or governments. Actually, the capital markets are going to force it. So you really cannot afford to fail. It's going to be imposed on you in one fashion or another. Final piece is going to be what we didn't talk about a lot today, Monica, perhaps for another discussion you may have, is the accountability piece. Who's going to be accountable at the end of the day? There's so many players here. How do we build accountability in a system so that, who's in 5 years from now, who's responsible? It's not going to be just Justin Trudeau or, Minister Wilkinson. Who's going to be responsible for what progress we will achieve, between now and the next 5 years. So, maybe it's kind of a version of Anne's chart there. It's not Anne's chart really, but let's call it Anne's chart. But what's going to be the version of that for the net zero journey? I think accountability is something we need to think a bit more about. That's how I'd perhaps not really summarize it today, but perhaps add a few thoughts. Merci.
Un gros merci Serge. Je sais à quel point c'est pas évident taking notes all day and then turning it into something that sounds highly articulate, which it absolutely did. And your comments around trust, credibility, action, accountability, I think that's a really important add. And all of the tensions that we're really going to need to work through in a thoughtful and informed fashion. Greatly appreciate your applying your expertise and insights and sharing them with us today. Well, actually, we have a workshop tomorrow to chart out some of our key priorities and topics for the next number of years. And so I took copious notes, and rest assured, those insights will find their way into our discussions tomorrow. So for now, it's my distinct pleasure to close the conference. I wouldn't be able to do that without extending a large number of thank yous. So I'm going to do that right now. And I really appreciate your taking the time to thank these individuals with me, but please hold your applause until the end. So I do want to begin by thanking first and foremost Geneviève Dunn, who is our communications and outreach specialist, who just started with us recently. This is her second event at the university. We don't even work from the university currently. So here she is planning an event in a room that she's never even been in, planning the most difficult conference in terms of logistics that we have ever undertaking, and doing it in a way that I just cannot tell you how professional, and the attention to detail. I think all of you could see that here today, just pulled off extremely well. Jen, thank you. This was really two events. It wasn't just one. You planned two major national conferences. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Other members of the Positive Energy team also worked very hard on this event, as well as, importantly, all of the research studies we undertook over the last 3 years. Many, many more than were talked about today. We really just gave you highlights of a few. So I've had the privilege of working with an absolutely phenomenal research team over the last 3 years. Our research director, Marissa Beck, who you heard from earlier this afternoon. Multiple faculty, senior fellows, and affiliates at the top of that list. My co-conspirator, Mike Cleland. Thank you, Mike. Can't tell you how grateful I am to have your support and engagement at Positive Energy. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Professor Stephen Bird, Professor Dwayne Bratt, Roland Harrison, Professor Eric LaChapelle, Nick, who I think is going to be joining us later, but for the moment has been pulled out to do the paid work that he does. But he has really contributed to our work in terms of time and generosity of sharing his expertise over the last number of years. Just a tremendous collaborator and partner for us. Andrew Pickford and Professor Bryson Robertson. Multiple research associates, Brendan Frank, who you heard from today, now at Innovative Research Group. We lost Brendan to Greg Lyle, and it's Greg's distinct benefit to be working with you now, Brendan. Dr. Patricia Larkin, who is on the line today. Ian Thompson, who is now in law school studying regulatory law, specifically in the energy sector. Our art consultant, Cameron Cross. Postdoctoral researchers, Dr. Heather Miller, who is now Professor Heather Miller over the course of the last few years. Doctoral candidates, Rafael Aguirre, who is now Dr. Aguirre. He received his doctorate over the course of the last 3 years with us. Xavier Deschênes-Filion, James Donald, Sébastien Gérard, Lindsay and Julien Thome at the back, who has been just a tremendous assistance to this event. Thank you. Undergraduate students, Alicia Aziz, Amy Richard, and Audrey Roy. and staff members, Sandy Chung. I don't know if Sandy is still around. Sandy is upstairs. Thank you, Sandy, who's been working with us on the online portion of the event. Raphael Desordi, many of you will know Raphael, who is now at Export Development Canada. So we're pleased for him in his latest move. And most of our students that have worked with us have gone on to work in the energy sector, armed with a really strong understanding of the opportunities and challenges when it comes to Canadian energy. I would be remiss if I also didn't mention the advisory council that we have at Positive Energy. That's just a tremendous, a number of them are in the room here today. Nick Nanos is our chair. Meredith Adler, I believe she joined us online. For those who are in the room, maybe just raise your hand if when I call your name. Francis Bradley, Tabitha Bull, Richard Carlson, Stephanie Clark. Mike also serves on our advisory council. Dave Collier, who's online. Lisa DeMarco, who I believe is also online. Rona Delfrari, who is represented here today by Trent Zacharias. Nilo Edwards from the FNMPC. Thank you, Jesse, for joining us on the FNMPC's behalf. Chris Henderson, who many have seen is online. Robert Hornung, Paul Jeekins, Molly Johnson, Shannon Joseph, Tanya Leach, who is also here, Louis Legault, Dave Lai, who is represented here by Sarah Gowland, Dave Morton from the BCUC, Jeffrey Simpson, who I saw earlier today, but I think had to take off for another commitment, Peter Tertsakian, and Julie Wu. Last but not least, a very huge thank you to our financial supporters, Alberta Energy, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission, the British Columbia Utilities Commission, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, Synovus, the Clean Resource Innovation Network, Electricity Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Ovintiv, SHIRK, and thanks also to Nanos Research, our official pollster. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you very much to those online for joining us. We wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for being with us today.